Nick Nelson, Senior Vice President of Corporate Purpose at Edelman, talks to host Doug Simon on PR's Top Pros Talk.
Nick, in your report, you said that nearly 2 out of 3 politicians are using language that undermines trust in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Is there a way to combat that so it can't be weaponized?
The unfortunate reality is ever since, 2020, following the murder of George Floyd and following this emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, even since then, detractors have sought out opportunities to weaponize diversity, equity, inclusion, or as we say, DEI. And the reality is that's just not what diversity, equity, inclusion is about. So to weaponize it is a choice, right? And so that's something that we have to keep in mind. What are the motivations behind, who and how DEI is positioned? Diversity, equity, inclusion inherently benefits everyone. So it's not taking opportunities away from any given community. It's expanding the pathways for those who traditionally have been systemically blocked from opportunities to have the same access that others have, right? So that's really important foundation laying to set the tone for talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. From there, you really want to invest in a few things. One, you want to create safe spaces to have these conversations. One thing, especially for those of us who are in this space, one thing that we sometimes may not always acknowledge is we know a lot more about the nuances and then ins and outs than perhaps someone who's not as close to it, right? So our job as practitioners and as facilitators and as counselors is to create the space for the dialogue, right? How do we encourage questions? How do we encourage constructive conversation? I facilitated many trainings and sessions and forums, and one of my ground rules for any session is to establish that at the outset so that we can have very constructive dialogue. I've heard so many questions or so many just statements that I don't know what I don't know, right? And even that kind of vulnerability and that moment of acknowledgement creates a tone in the room so that we can have honest conversation. And that's really where we see the most progress, when everyone feels safe to bring their concerns forward or bring their questions forward, or really want to understand, when you get to the root of it, how do I participate in this? So that's one of the most important things. The second thing I would say is to show the work. It's easy to say, DEI does this and DEI does that. But if I can't see that, it's a little bit harder for me to grasp onto. So when we can show, for example, that investing in DEI initiatives have yielded, a 25% increase of women in leadership roles, or when we can show that investing in a DEI initiative has resulted in an increase in Black and Hispanic representation in middle management roles that didn't exist before, that's when you can say, I see what this is doing and I see what my part is in it.
It's not a monolithic group, as you well understand. One of my concerns, and whether I was standing or not can clearly be debated, is that because DEI has been redefined for a chunk of the public as something that's a negative force, unfortunately, I'm not going to repeat what people think on that. Does it need a rebranding? Do we need to call it something more harder to disparage or re-identify, like Smart Workplace 2035 or Smart Workforce 2035? Companies are really taking the steps, continuing the programs. They just don't want to talk about it, which also makes it harder in the environment. What do you think about a rebrand? And I'm open if you have any other suggestions for different titles and names for it.
We work in communication. We love rebranding, right? I think one of the most interesting takeaways from the research that we did, the report is called the 2024 Edelman Trust Barometer Special Report, Business and Racial Justice. When we use the term DEI, the acronym DEI, it didn't resonate. When we articulated the acronym fully, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it resonated. And we saw the same thing with ESG, right? When we use those initials, because it has been, to the point that you made earlier, weaponized, it didn't land. But then when we expanded what that is, because it gives you a little bit more of a tangible understanding, we recognize that. So to your point about rebranding, a lot of our organizations that we partner with or that we advise, some of them use DEI, some of them use DEIB, with the B standing for belonging. Some have been creative and used JEDI, so justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And that's intentional, right? You use the acronyms that describe the work that you're doing. And so I think there is an opportunity for each organization that wants to pursue DEI initiatives to really think about what that looks like and sounds like for their organization. There's no rule that it has to be called DEI. You can call it, whatever resonates with your organization, and what resonates with their employees. That's who you're taking care of most. And when your employees are invested in this work, and they see how they show up in this work and they see how this benefits them, not just as an individual or as a specific community, but the entire workforce, you're a lot more likely to get buy-in and then see the fruits of that initiative show up in your workplace.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And as a personal lover of acronyms, I'm taking away one lesson: stay away from them in this area. So a question is, what can communicators do to make sure more people within an organization actually see themselves as benefiting from these diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives?
It's such a good question because, as community oriented as we are, we want to see what's in it for me, right? So again, going back to the point of showing the work, how is this investment into diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, whatever we choose to call it, what is that producing? So being able to show again how you made progress with advancing women in the workforce, advancing people with disabilities in the workforce, advancing just anyone who's facing some kind of challenge with having access and equity in, opportunities. How are you showing that work? But then also creating opportunity for people to participate in the process. Just because you don't have a DEI title does not mean that you can't participate in DEI. One of the wonderful things about Edelman is we have our employee network groups that speak to different communities. But one of the points that we make is you do not have to be a part of this community to participate in this network group. So being able to join our Hispanic employee group or our faith-based employee group, just to get those different perspectives and then understand not just how they're different, but then what we share in common. And then being focused on that common goal of, I want to make this workplace, I want to make the society and the world around me better for not just me, but for the community that I care about, which is my colleagues. So being able to show people not just what is coming out of DEI initiatives, but that you, individually, you can participate in this.
Yeah, I love that having a broader audience be able to be part of affinity groups that makes such a difference, because while they might provide support as a purely focused affinity group, broadening it is where the learnings can really happen in shared perspective in a safe space, as you look at before. I saw another opportunity for business from your report, and that's that people were nearly 3 times as likely to say that their employer was doing a good job of addressing racism than they said government was doing a good job addressing racism. What does that mean as an opportunity for businesses?
So many things. That one stat, you can just extrapolate so much from it. I think the biggest opportunity for business is to continue the work and to lead the work and show what that looks like, and kind of demonstrate that model for other institutions. So the expectation is important that, the point that you made, 3 times more likely, the expectation of government was the highest. Government was the lowest at meeting the moment. We can spend another hour talking about why that is. But employers outsize the expectation by that much. And that just means that, you know, employees do care about DEI. Employees want to work at a place where they can see themselves and people like them. And they want to know that their employer is going to take a stand on social issues, not that just benefit, again, them as individuals or their specific communities, but the community that is represented within this workforce. And so business being able to set the tone for what that looks like. There's still more work to do. There's always more work to do, but business meeting the moment and exceeding the moment really does show how important that employee buy-in is. And then how do we facilitate those conversations internally so that externally we're an example to the rest of the community?
Yeah, and building trust, as you're talking about, is just so important on that. I touched on standing before about whether I had standing. Is there a best messenger? Who should the messenger or messengers be when you're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion? I liked what you said, is it doesn't have to just be the person with the title.
Right. And that's exactly it. The message, the medium is the message, or in this case, the messenger, right? And so what we found in our research is that those who are in the C-suite, those who are, heads of DEI, chief diversity officers, they're actually lower on the trust scale than my peers, my manager, my desk mates. So these are the people who we trust that DEI initiatives are working, that DEI initiatives make sense for me, for my community, for my workplace, and that DEI initiatives have tangible outputs and business outcomes. So being able to see, to your point, how a more diverse workforce yields more innovation yields more profit. More profit means I'm taking care of at the end of the day. So being able to paint that line or show that through line is really so important. And being able to hear that from my peers, being able to hear that from my mentor, my manager in that role, really does help land that message. And that's not to say that heads of DEI and CEOs can't be the messengers. We just want to make sure that we're equipping those who can amplify the message to make it land beyond where it might land the first time, right? So you get the CEO newsletter, right? And great, love that. Then if my manager takes that newsletter and sends it to our team and says, I'm behind this, I support this, let me know how I can help you, that tends to create a lot more trust, in addition to that foundation that leadership is set.
Obviously, this is such a tough subject, and it can be really challenging in the experience and frustrating when you see things out there. Are you optimistic about where this is going in the future, and maybe some thoughts on what can help make you be more and help make others be more optimistic as well?
Short answer is yes. I am optimistic. That may be my own character flaw, but I remain optimistic. The reality is in 2020, when we saw such an uptick in interest and investment in diversity, equity, and inclusion, we predicted even then pendulum has to swing back, right? And so even into 2021, when a lot of these DEI initiatives were peaking, we were seeing rumblings of, anti-woke movements or lawsuits, as you've seen kind of take place in the past year and a half. So we've been prepared for this for a long time. And what is oddly encouraging is everything that's happened, we've kind of predicted, we've kind of understood that when the movement sways back the other way, this is what's going to happen. So making sure we help our colleagues, our clients, our employees approach this with resilience. And again, commit to the results, commit to the work. Standing ground can be scary sometimes, especially given kind of the news cycle around us. But one of my favorite examples of this, when organizations were announcing DEI officers, there was kind of a social contingent that would push back and say, this company's gone woke. I won't name the company, but one company in particular that's
Right.
fairly known for being somewhat conservative named a DEI officer. And then when the social media community kind of came for that company, the company's response was very simply, yes, and. And they had to move on. They stood that space, they held that space and said,
Right.
we are committed to this because it is the right thing to do and because it does have tangible business outcomes and it
Right.
cultivates our employee community so much that it would be silly of us not to invest in this. And so that's really the takeaway, that intentional investment and committing to the work really makes sure that DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, whatever brand we choose, is able to thrive.
I will add that I think your optimism is a feature, not a bug. Do you want to mention any final thoughts?
I would say these are the exact types of forums that we are able to continue this work. So being able to educate your audience on the ins and outs, how to get started, how to navigate is not always the easiest work to do, but it is necessary and it's important because we can, again, point to business performance. We can point to when you have an inclusive organization, you can drive employee loyalty and retention. And then when your employees feel like they belong, they're your strongest advocates. So being able to paint that picture and help those who are interested, or those who might be skeptical, open some conversation and dialogue is a great opportunity. So thank you.
Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.